Welcome to
Boring.
But Effective.
Hey, thanks for joining us, guys. Today we have Mike Harut, the responsible investment manager from Munro. He's also a Melbourne Uni lecturer for sustainable investing as part of the master's and undergraduate course. Mike, welcome.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, David. Great to
Oh,
be here with you.
thank you so much for joining us. To kick things off, can you give us an idea what's the actual aim of the Munro Climate Change Leaders Fund?
Absolutely. So I guess to put it into one sentence, we're really trying to do something quite simple, which is to invest in global growth listed companies that help enable decarbonisation and therefore actually stand to benefit from a structural tailwind, which is the global effort to decarbonize the planet and the 50, some say up to $100 trillion that needs to be spent to actually get the world to net zero. And when I say that, usually people think, oh, this must be some sort of ethical or impact fund, or there's some sort of trade-off. I need to be sacrificing my returns to invest in these sorts of companies. Uh, we're here to kind of dispel that myth. This fund is driven by, as I said, the dollars that need to be spent to decarbonize and the dollars that are being spent to decarbonize. And we're really trying to just track the companies that actually benefit from this structural trend. Not to say that the companies themselves aren't doing really good things like, developing renewable projects, et cetera, et cetera. But, what we've demonstrated now in the 3+ years of this fund is that the performance is there as well as being invested in these companies who themselves are helping this transition along.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's not a peace pipe, kumbaya, everything is good around the campfire kind of thing. It's companies that are really taking it on themselves. They're not waiting for government intervention. They're saying, well, this is the way of the world going forward, and we're going to take advantage of that. So I guess that leads into the next part of so how does Munro select companies to invest in as to achieve the target returns as part of the Climate Change Leaders Fund?
Yeah, so I guess, I won't go into the whole detail of what Munro does overall, but generally what we do is, we look for big structural changes going on in the world. So this is one of the many structural changes that we invest in. This fund invests exclusively in that theme. So step one is to identify the structural change, which the team did, many years ago, and it's really only sort of accelerated the underlying drivers of that. Within that, then we sort of find okay, like within this sort of climate change opportunity, we've looked at the spending that needs to occur and then split that into essentially 4 sub-themes. So clean energy, clean transport, energy efficiency, and then the circular economy. Um, so that's sort of all we really are doing on the top-down level. And then beyond that, or the next step, or step 2, is to select companies for this fund in the same way that we do bottom up, one by one, in the same way that we do for every fund. So um, we are looking essentially for stocks that can double within 5 years. The way that a stock can double within 5 years is for its earnings, generally for its earnings to double within 5 years. There could be some stocks that re-rate or derate, etc. But generally what we're looking for is stocks that can double their earnings within 5 years. And I guess for me, like one of the roles that I have within this fund is obviously, because we are looking for companies that are, as we say, enabling decarbonisation. One of the things that I do as the responsible investment manager is just to sort of make sure and just check that every company that we've actually put into the fund is genuinely contributing to that goal. So at the end of it, we end up with roughly 20 stocks. It can kind of vary up, plus minus 5, that are all in different ways in those different areas of interest benefiting from this long-term trend. And then ultimately, where for each of them, we can demonstrate that there's upside in the short term, but then also within 5 years that they can effectively double. And so if we get all of that right, then things should go well.
Well, as we know, it's a tricky game picking which one is going to do well and what's not. Are you able to give us who name 2 that are in the fund?
Sure. One that we've had more recently added to the fund is a company called CATL. So CATL is a company that many people probably haven't heard of, but if you go out into the streets and see an electric vehicle driving, the odds are that probably there's a CATL battery in there. So CATL is actually the largest global developer of EV batteries. EVs themselves have been a bit of a challenge in many parts. There's a sort of waning policy support in the US, for example. The EV makers themselves have been really struggling because there's a lot of competition. But CATL, we think, is quite well placed because the battery supply chain itself is quite consolidated, so which enables them to protect their profitability. But the most exciting thing about this company is where they're going in terms of not just providing batteries for electric vehicles, but also for grid storage and grid stabilization. So you need more of that as you do more, as you add more renewables to the grid, as that grid resilience becomes more important. And there's a whole bunch of other, I guess, markets that they can go into the future. So you can Google this yourself, but they have some examples of electric vessels. They're working with these electric vertical takeoff and landing companies where you can it's like a drone that you get into and it goes up and down. And electric trucks, where in China they predict, they think that by 2030 they can get to 60% electric trucks, which is quite amazing. So that's quite a company that we're quite interested in and excited about, both given those growth opportunities, but then also given that sort of market structure and the fact that they can protect their profitability. There are lots of others. I mean, one other one maybe that I'll just mention is a company called Quanta Services. So Quanta Services is essentially a very large labor force of specialized blue collar workers that help develop both renewable projects and transmission and distribution projects in the US. So in the US under Trump, that whole area has been, renewables squarely has been a bit more challenged from a policy headwind perspective, for reasons I think that are quite obvious. But the grid is something that is bipartisan. And so we think, and obviously very important for the transition, you need to connect the renewables to the grid, right? So, and it's very old and it's resilient. It's at risk from climate change itself. So you need more grid, and this workforce is hard to replicate. And so Quanta Services is a company that's been in the fund for a while and it's been performing well, that we like. So yeah, those are two examples.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Mike. That's terrific. And now, what do you think the future looks like according to the guys at Munro? Where are we heading in the next sort of 5, 10 years?
Yeah, it's the future changes, of course, but we think from a climate change sort of thematic perspective and a decarbonisation perspective. Maybe I'll just make 3 points. The first one is, policy-wise, the US has gone from being a big supporter of climate change from a policy perspective to now being less of a supporter, obviously, under the Trump administration. So that has been a headwind. I think for us, because we are active, we don't have to invest in everything. We can be very selective. Like we were aware of this, nearly 2 years ago when the sort of first sniffs of the next US election were coming around, and that Trump might win, and he did win. So I think there are sort of headwinds from a policy perspective, but I think it's important to kind of put those into perspective. So, for example, like the US left the Paris Climate Agreement, but no other country has followed it. And even in the US, I think it's fair to say that because of the electricity demand that they have from AI, reshoring, electrification, things like that, and the fact that it's hard to build nuclear, it's hard to build new gas, we do actually think that between now and 2030, the outlook for renewables is actually still pretty good because it's hard to build kind of anything else. And I think the administration, if you listen to them, I think they will kind of admit that too. I think for us, probably the next thing that we would be looking for in the next sort of 5 years is to kind of continue to look at this opportunity from a broad perspective. So I think throughout the last 2 years, I think what's really helped us is to try to get out of the way of the more sort of politically sensitive parts of this opportunity, such as wind energy, for example, and go into the more the areas where you don't need policy support or where the policy support is sort of bipartisan in the US. So things like the electricity grid, which I mentioned, nuclear energy, and there's a whole host of energy efficiency technologies which just make good business sense. So, for example, commercial HVAC. If you replace your HVAC, often within 2 to 3 years, you can get the cost of it completely back because you save energy, which is good for the environment, good for the tenant. Like it's sort of as long as you've got the money to spend up front, then it's um, a no-brainer. And then probably just the final thing just to mention is for the US, as I said, that policy headwind is there, but there are things we think that are happening which support um, growth in renewables, storage, nuclear, and energy efficiency. And those underlying things are AI. AI, is powered by data centers which use a lot of electricity. Microsoft, Google, Meta, Amazon, they all have ambitions around clean energy. So they're buying these long-term power purchase agreements. Next to that, as I said, it's hard to put up new gas, hard to put up new nuclear. So renewables are some of the option that's there. That also supports the electricity grid. And I think whilst the pace of electrification has slowed in the US, I do think it is something that is happening nonetheless. Like people are over time switching still, even in the US, to more EVs, which does mean more electricity demand, which supports all of these companies as well. So, yeah, I say to sort of summarize, the policy headwinds are there, but only in the US and in a kind of a narrow way. We continue to look for breadth to try to not just narrowly focus on wind manufacturers, for example. And then in the US, I think this whole electricity demand inflection where you're going from no growth in electricity to now 2% per annum growth for all of the reasons that I mentioned is just a really big tailwind supporting every kind of electricity and generation source.
Absolutely, that's brilliant. Thanks so much, Mike. That was a terrific recap of how things are going to look over the next few years and how you guys are taking advantage of that. So thank you so much. Now we
My
move to
pleasure.
the fun bit. All right. Now, what's your favorite meal?
Okay, so these were the questions that I found the hardest to answer, to be honest. So my favorite meal, and I actually had it about 2 weeks ago, was my grandma makes something called dolma. So I'm Armenian, so if you think of like Greek dolmadas, it's basically the same thing. It's sort of like mince and rice, and she wraps them in like grape leaves. And it's something that I've had since my childhood. And my grandma is in her late 80s, but is still around. So I'm very fortunate to be able to have that meal still every now and then, and so I put that down as my favorite meal.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's terrific, and I'm sure every time she sees you, she's straight into the kitchen, wants to make it for you. So that's
Yeah,
fantastic.
it has been a while actually. You'd be surprised, but yeah, yeah.
That's great. Next last question.
Sure.
Um, who is someone either living or deceased that you'd love to have the opportunity to take round to grandma's place and have some dolma?
Okay, yeah. So I guess yeah, obviously my grandma is the one person who I'd like to share the meal with, but the next to that, I was tossing up a few ideas, but the one that I'm going to go with is a bit of an odd one. Somebody who lived about around 2,000 years ago, I think. The Roman Stoic philosopher called Epictetus. So people probably don't know who Epictetus was, but in the kind of pre-Christian Rome, uh, I think the sort of Stoic philosophy, which people might be sort of familiar with, was quite prevalent, and it's really had a resurgence now. But Epictetus specifically had quite an interesting story where he started off as a slave, and he was actually freed by his slave master and went on to found this school. And so I think that personal story would be something really interesting to talk to him about. And then the other thing was in terms of the sort of Stoic philosophy, which I think was quite applicable to day-to-day life, unlike much of the academic stuff that you occasionally come across today. I think, he was really all about this idea that other people have also said where, we should be focusing on things that we can control rather than the things that we can't control. And so I've personally found that useful in my life with, having little kids and with health and so forth. But then also I think it works with investing as well, where, you should just focus on what you can control, which is you're making sure that you're following your investment process, making sure that you are, um, as we say at Munro, turning over stones, making sure that you're sort of doing all the work that's required. But then, sometimes, of course, things do go wrong, and that's why we have diversified portfolios, and just kind of, yeah, I guess accepting the things that you can't control. So, Epictetus is my choice.
Epictetus, he sounds like a cracking bloke. I reckon he would have had the Dolomar on the school menu too if he had the opportunity to hang out with you and your grandma. So I got to tell you, I'll need to do some research. I'm pretty sure there won't be any photos of him, but we'll find some sort of description, no doubt. And that sounds. I'd love to be a fly on the wall there. That'd be amazing. So
Yeah, meeting somebody from 2000 years ago would be pretty cool.
yeah, that's amazing. All right, Mike. Hey, thanks so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you on, and I look forward to the Munro Climate Change Leaders Fund is an absolute ripper. Nick Griffin and the team there are doing a great job with the management. So thanks so much for coming on, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks very much, David. Much appreciated.
Good on you, mate.
But effective.